Alliant Energy argues Wisconsin needs more natural gas storage to keep the lights on in the state line, but some activists in Beloit warn their state is falling behind in clean energy goals. Just outside the town of Beloit, Alliant Energy plans to build a liquefied natural gas facility across 100 acres. WIFR's Nathaniel Langley learns why some in the community sound the alarm on the project.
The plan is natural gas storage to keep the energy resource on standby for Beloit and most of Wisconsin. Alliant claims it'll protect the state's electricity, but others warn of dire consequences for the state line.
Any problem that you see in a community has someone that is directly responsible.
When it comes to Beloit's air quality, City Council member Yusuf Adamo believes Alliant Energy's Riverside Energy Center should be held responsible.
It's not going to matter how fast our electric grid can move if someone is dying of asthma.
Alliant's latest proposal is a liquefied natural gas facility. It would house 2 billion cubic feet of fossil fuels.
The air doesn't stay in one place. If this does leak or damages the watershed, that's not going to affect just one area.
In its application to Wisconsin's Public Service Commission, Alliant claims the $500 million project would protect natural gas supplies in the state.
Methane traps greenhouse gases.
Most of Wisconsin's energy comes from fossil fuels. Healthy Climate Wisconsin's Brittany Keys believes Alliant's proposed facility holds her state back.
They are taking us backwards and really entrenching us into this high polluting and dangerous type of energy generation.
Alliant says the facility will keep natural gas reserves closer to customers, leading to consistent service in the winter.
The corporate reality or the systemic reality of dealing with these is difficult.
Environmentalists argue the utility should consider the project's climate consequences.
People shouldn't have to always be in the room to say, hey, please don't kill me.
To learn how Alliant's affected air quality in Beloit, Brittany Keys has started a petition calling for the utility to pay for monitoring PM 2.5 in the area. That can be found on change.org.
Thank you, Nathaniel. And if Wisconsin greenlights the facility, construction could begin in February 2026 and end in May 2028.